Alright, welcome to the stream. I am going to be walking through the assignment for week 9 for this class that I am an instructor for, because I think that there's some benefits there. For those who might be catching this on YouTube, I have already done some prep work for this assignment, mainly to try and avoid having any sort of passwords come up on stream. So I've already pulled down the files from the Linux lab servers that they have, and then I've already got serve running. So I'm going to hide my terminal, and we're going to start with a blank HTML file. I've already walked through this assignment so that I could more easily go through the various parts and pieces of it. Hopefully have it be a little more succinct than my last video, and also make it easier to timestamp the various points that I will hit. So first I wanted to walk through the actual assignment description a little bit. So this command is an SCP command. It's what I used basically to pull the files down to my computer. So in this assignment we're gonna use AJAX, which these days in the industry usually refers to fetch, but historically meant actual asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which was usually accomplished through the XML HTTP request that they talk about. But I'm not going to use that at all, because I like fetch more, and it works just as well for 95% of the use cases. Alright. So, jumping into this assignment, we'll have assign09.html. You should have already made this as part of your week 2 setup for the future. So there's 2 parts to this assignment, part 1, part 2. They're both pretty similar. Part 1 allows you to select one of 4 countries and displays the 10 largest cities and their population. So this one is super straightforward so far as what you're actually doing. How to do it is a different story, because that is a little more complicated. So we'll get there. The first step that you'll want to do is grab all of the text files that you'll need for this assignment. This command will actually get all of them into your week 9 public HTML folder. So I'd recommend doing that on Linux Lab. And then you'll need to type this out because it's not in the assignment. But you could use this SCP command to get it to your computer, or use something like CyberDuck or whatever else you've been using to copy files back and forth throughout the semester. Alright, so once you have the files, you will want to pull them up. So I already have them. So 5000, so say USA.txt is one of them. And so this is one of those text files. So we'll come back to that here in a second. Let's zoom in here. Alright, so yep, there's one of the text files. They're very simple. So you'll need to do a request to retrieve the proper file from the website for the corresponding country. Then use it to update your web page. You don't have to do any sort of like styling if you don't want to for this assignment, but it might help if you make it look a little better. So there's 4 options: US, Mexico, Canada, and Russia, and there's a file for each of them. These file names are what you'll want to be using. So then part 2 of the assignment, you want to add another section to the same web page that has a button and a text input field. And the input field is used to enter the file name or URL of a JSON file. I would recommend just doing file name. That's a little bit easier to work with. And generally you don't want to go around requesting full URLs. And so then the onClick event of the button makes a request to read the specified file, and then you'll need to parse it, format it, and incorporate it into your web page. And you have to display these 5 pieces of information: the first name, last name, address, GPA, and major. Thankfully this is just random test data and not actually like real grades, because that would be scary, but it's very generic. And so you want to set the default value of the input so that people don't have to type it all over the place, and keep the first part working. You also need to do a little bit of error handling if the file name they request does not exist. Again, I would recommend just having this be they type in JSON, because it's a little bit easier to work with that way. So let me so let me pull up the version that I have working so you can kind of see what it means when both parts are on the same web page. Alright, so here you have your select with 4 things. You pick one and fetch the top 10 cities. And then another one, fetch the top 10 cities. I don't think they specified what this button should be called or if there even needs to be a button. I'd recommend there be a button, but that's just because it's easier to work with that way. You could listen to the change event, but I usually try not to do that. To the change or input event. But I usually try not to do that when there's requests involved to avoid overloading the network. Anyway, so you can go through and pick a city, and then you can fetch a JSON file, or you can fetch the other one. There's only 2 of them. If you mistype it or type something else, it just says file not found. So that's the end goal that we're going to get to with this code we're going to write. Hopefully it makes sense to you. If it doesn't, please ask somewhere. Ideally in the discussion for this week so that you can get points for it. But if you're watching the stream, chat is a great place as well, because then I can actually answer it right now. If you're watching on YouTube, put it in the discussion, because that way you can get points for it. Yeah, so that's the end result. So now we're going to jump over to this blank screen, and we're going to work through it. So the first thing you'll need is some sort of HTML scaffolding. VS Code has what is called Emmet built in, and the exclamation mark is an Emmet abbreviation for like your standard HTML scaffold. So we'll leave that there, and then we'll just call this assignment 9 file reading. And then go down to body. So you're aware what just happened is I have a JavaScript package called Prettier installed on my machine. It's also a VS Code extension, and so I have it formatting on save so that I don't have to think about what my code is formatted like. Alright, so let's go ahead and add like an H1, and it can just be week 9 assignment. Alright, so we'll go for that. And so now there should be something here. Yep. Excellent. So we're editing the correct file. So there's 2 parts. So we'll do a div, part 1, and then another div with an ID of part 2 to give us 2 different places to work. And again, that's Prettier formatting. Okay, so in part 1, sometimes what I like to do is stick a comment right here, and the main thing that we need is this last requirement. This pretty much sums up all of part 1, and I'll just stick that in a comment. So Prettier theoretically could wrap this automatically, but it doesn't for whatever reason. I think there's a configuration option I could set. Anyway, so got now comment of what we need to do for part 1. Part 2, doesn't really have a short version, so we'll just take the whole thing and put it in there. And so as you can guess by that, part 2 will be the more complicated part. Alright, so I'm going to close this README now, because we've got the main pieces of it pulled out into our actual file we're working in. And so now I can just kind of throw this up in the corner. Let's make sure that's a good spot for it. Yeah, so we'll go for that. We'll make this a little smaller. Alright, so this, and this, and one second, I'm gonna pull the chat off the screen. That's that little white box that has nothing in it. So that I can let's see. Alright, let's save that. Alright, so now the chat's off the screen, which means I can have this go all the way over. Great. Alright, hopefully this font size is good. I think it is. Bump it up one more. That should be good. Alright, so part 1. Your web page must allow the user to select one of the 4 countries: US, Mexico, Canada, and Russia. And then you make a request to retrieve the text file and display it. So, what I usually like to start with is what HTML will I need for this. So, this screams select, the other one does as well, but we're not supposed to use that, and we're supposed to let them enter it. Sorry about that. So this can be a country selector, and then we have 4 options. Our values will be the 4 file names. So USA, and then we'll do that 4 times. VS Code has on Windows, it's Alt-Shift, and then you can use up or down to duplicate the line. And then we'll do Canada. And then we want Mexico. And then we want Russia. Alright, and then we want somewhere to put the file contents. So, put a div around it. And then since this is just like text content, I'm going to wrap it in a pre-tag. As this little tooltip says, the pre-element represents a block of pre-formatted text. And so, in this case, the text has like some tab separation and such to get things to line up. So we're going to let it stay formatted. So this will be cities list. Yeah. So I think that's all the HTML. Oh, and we'll need a button to trigger it. ID. So we'll fetch top 10 cities. And I guess we can wrap all this in a form. Another VS Code tip, if you use on Windows at least Alt and then up or down, it'll move the line that you're currently on, or whatever lines you have selected. Alright, so there's a form, and I'll format it for us. Okay, so I think that's all the HTML I need to work with for part 1. So we should be able to refresh this and see the HTML. It doesn't currently do anything. In fact, it refreshes the page on every time we click the button. but that is fine for now. So part 2, so we want another section of our web page that has 2 elements. So we need a button, and this can be ID of fetch JSON. So we'll get the JSON file, we'll have an input, type is text, and our value will default to JSON. We're not going to do .text because we don't want people to be able to request arbitrary files. We want just the 2 test files that exist, which are JSON and JSON1. And so they don't need any more than that. So we'll give this an ID of JSON input. And so then we'll need somewhere to stick our result. And that should be all of the HTML we need. So if we refresh, we can see that we can get the JSON file and fetch the top 10 cities. Again, we can wrap this in a form to have those be tied together. We could put the result in it as well, but I don't think we need to. At least not in this case. Alright, so this is like the minimal HTML that you could use for this assignment. You should feel free to add more divs or whatever other elements you want if you want to spend some time styling it, but if you at least do this, you should be able to get the assignment finished. Okay, so now we are going to come down here and create a script tag. So something important to note, technically speaking, you can put a script tag in any portion of your HTML, even up in the head. And the browser will usually handle it just fine. But generally, the script tag goes in the body, and you will typically put it at the end of the body, just before the closing tag, because the HTML file gets executed in the order that it's presented in. So if you put it above the, like in the head or at the top of the body, the HTML elements aren't actually there yet. So if you want to do things like document.get element by ID and have that actually work, so like fetch JSON here, if I want this to work, it has to be below where that element is defined. So something that is super useful in writing JavaScript is the console and the debugger. They are built into Chrome. I have mine set to be on the bottom, and I can make this a little bit taller. Alright, so if you right click in Chrome and do inspect, it'll pull up the Elements tab. Generally that has the console at the bottom, but you can also go to the console directly. And then one other really helpful place is the Sources tab, which lets you do things like put in a debugger. So say you wanted to pause when it gets to executing that. Or like log something. So now we refresh. Oh, I didn't actually put it as a log point. Oh. There we go. So now it's a log point. So in theory, it would log. Breakpoints tend to work better in JavaScript code though, so like right here, when we get to the console log, we are now paused in the debugger, which lets us do some nifty things like step over the function call, which skips that line entirely. We'll come back to this more later and explore it, but the debugger is really nifty. Anyway, so as you can see here on the bottom, we can console log and get the button output for us, but if, for instance, we were to put this script tag at the start of the body, it will still work. It shouldn't throw any errors because we're not doing anything, but it console logs null because there is no element by that. And same idea if we put it in the head. So, generally speaking, if you're working with like a third-party script, like jQuery or something, which you're not allowed to use for this class, you would usually put those before your actual scripts. And sometimes those are recommended to go in the head so they can start loading as soon as possible. Sometimes they're not. But usually your actual scripts for your website or application will go towards the end of the body tag. So yeah, that's where that goes. And so we can console log stuff down here. That's a really useful way to debug, as well as using the debugger command. So when you use the debugger command, it will pause at that spot, which lets you do things like step over or into. We are not going to go down that rabbit hole. But yeah, so that is where we're going to go now. So we have this HTML. I am going to now move our comments down into the JavaScript because our goal now is to write the JavaScript to make these happen. So we've got part 1 and part 2. So this is part 1. Alright. Let's take those away so it doesn't pause on us or log stuff. So a really useful thing to add is in your console settings, you can click this little gear in Chrome and click Preserve Log. Logging XML HTTP requests is also useful, but we're not going to do that because we can use what is called the Network tab. So we'll go through that in a second. So first, we need some JavaScript code, because otherwise the Network tab is not going to do much for us. So the first thing we need to do is, since we added a button, we need to make this happen when they click the button. So document.get element by ID, and this ID is fetch cities. Alright, so this is now our button, as we just saw when I was console logging it. And so we're going to add an event listener, which is a built-in method for JavaScript and HTML in the DOM. And we want to listen to the click event, and then we want to add a handler for this event, or a listener. So this is the function in JavaScript that will execute whenever the button is clicked on. So we could do a function that just console logs hi. And so now every time we click this button, we will console log hi. Since it's a submit button, we're also navigating, as you can see here, which is not what we would like to do. In order to prevent that, you can your event listener receives the event object as a parameter, and so we are going to do event, and most events will have a prevent default method on them that you can call. And so calling that method will now make it so that our page does not refresh, so we can clear our console, and now it just says hi over and over again. And our page doesn't flash and flicker and do weird things. Alright, so now we are console logging hi. So let's go ahead and attach the event listener for part 2 as well. So document.get element by ID, fetch JSON, add event listener, click, and again we will need the event so that we can prevent the default, which for a submit button is essentially trigger the action on the form. If there's no action specified, it basically reloads the page with all the form data as query params. Hello from Jason. Alright, so now we refresh, so we have our 2 event listeners working. We're not currently doing anything real substantial in them, but they are hooked up and working. So now we can do stuff. Okay. So this part, your web page must allow the user to select one of the 4 countries. So instead of console logging hi, let's go ahead and grab the form, or the country selector, and grab the value off it. So selected country is that, and we'll go ahead and add that to our console log message. So now we say hi USA, hi Canada, hi Mexico, hi Russia, whatever we choose. You'll note that we are printing out the value, not what is displayed, because what is displayed has different casing than the actual file name. And so that is helpful. And that is because in our HTML we set the value equal to something different. If we took that off, the value would be whatever the option is. But thankfully we have a way to set the value to something else. Alright, so now we have our selected country, so we can go ahead and delete this line. They're allowed to select a country. So now we should make an HTTP request. We're going to use fetch, not XML HTTP request, and display the data. So, quick primer on fetch. So there is a great article on MDN using fetch. Fetch is built into the browser. It has existed for a long time. It's been built in since these versions of the various browsers. Note that Internet Explorer doesn't support it, but if you are ever working on something that needs to support older browsers, there is a polyfill for fetch, and I think that lets you use fetch all the way back to IE8, I want to say. IE10. So, once you go back pretty far, ideally you don't have to support Internet Explorer 11 or 10, but there are definitely still places that do. Thankfully I don't. Anyway, so I haven't had to support IE11 since outside of one project in my entire career. So we are going to use fetch. This is like the most basic fetch request. You might not have seen this syntax before. So anything that is using .then and not a third-party library is using what's called a promise. I don't think the reading material really gets into it, but it is a way to do asynchronous programming similar to callbacks. And when I say asynchronous, I mean code that executes not in a linear fashion. So this code is actually asynchronous because it will execute this part, but then this code is basically a callback or event listener that happens whenever the button is clicked. So you've already been doing asynchronous programming. It's nothing too scary. But promises are another built-in method to accomplish those. So this is the basic form of what we're going to be doing. We're not having to supply any request options because the defaults work for us. We're not uploading any data, so we don't have to do that. We will want to check that a fetch was successful. And that's about it so far as things we have to check in all of this. Yeah, so that's a great article on using fetch. So that's what we're going to do here. So like I said, I already have the files pulled down. So like USA.txt, like I showed before, and then there's like Mexico.txt. So these files are already pulled down, and so when I do the fetch request, so here we can do a fetch, we're going to use what's called a template literal. I have no idea if the material already covered template literals, but they're also called template strings, and they are a way to do string concatenation and other fancy things without having to use a bunch of plus signs. So this is, zoom in, this is the basic idea. You have some string text and you stick something in the middle of it, string text. They're really useful. They can be used as well for multi-line strings. And yeah, so they're really useful. We're going to use one right here. So our fetch request, again, you want to make sure it's relative on the Linux lab, and relative will also work in this case that I'm in. And so then we want to do the selected country. We're not going to do any sort of like validation because it's a select input, so there's only the 4 options. And then throw the .text on there. And that is actually all you need to send off the request. So now we're going to look at the network tab. Let's clear that out. I would highly recommend checking this preserve log button if you haven't before, because the log tends to go away. Okay, so now we are fetching the text file. So for this case, we know that all 4 text files will exist. So fetch, you use .then, and when it is fulfilled, we get a response, which you usually shorten to res. I don't know why, but that's what we usually shorten it to in the industry. And so in this case, we're working with text. So you'll call the .text method, and it will transform the body into text. And so we will then get some data. For now, we'll just console log the data. Alright, so this should look very similar to the example on using fetch. So we'll refresh, so it takes effect to clear our console and our network tab, and go to Russia, fetch Russia, and as you can see, we now have Russian data. So now, what are we doing with the data? Well, we're going to stick it into our HTML. We have our cities list, so we will go ahead and grab that element. So document.get element by ID, cities list, and we're going to do inner text because it's just some text, so it doesn't need to be parsed as HTML, and so we'll just set that to the data. Alright, so now we refresh. We select, say, Mexico this time, and it did not work. But our console gave us an error. Inner text is not a function. So, if you wanted to, you could pull up a new window and search for that. Inner text is not a function, and you would probably get some Stack Overflow messages. But the basic idea is you just assign the value instead of calling it as a function. So here we would go equals data. Alright, so now we try this again. Mexico. Okay. And if we switch to USA, it just replaces the data, which is exactly what we want. Alright, so I think that we are done with part 1. So that's the basic gist for part 1. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't think there's anybody in the chat, but if there is, you could say something and ask questions. Alright. So hopefully, so let's walk through this again and clean it up a little bit. So we need to grab the element that we want to attach an event listener to. So that's what this does, and then we attach the event listener. We want to listen to the click event. There's a whole bunch of other events, but in this case click is fine. And then we'll take event and prevent the default. Another thing that we could do instead is grab the form. So I'll give this an ID of country form, and instead we could grab country form and listen to the submit event. And so what that will do is when we pick one of these, you could press enter, or not enter, you can press enter on the button, and that will submit the form and run this function. It's more useful down on the bottom one, which is actually where we're going to do it. So JSON form. So we're going to switch this to JSON form and listen to the submit event. And so what that lets us do is press enter down here, and as you can see in the console down there, we're saying hello whenever I press enter, which is nice in that now I don't have to click the button if I don't want to. Alright, I'm not seeing any questions, so let's walk through again what we're doing in the actual event listener. So first we prevent the default, which the default for submit is, or clicking on a submit button, is to reload the page or do the form action if there's one defined. So we want to stop that because we want to do our things instead. And so then we grab the element that is our select and grab the value off it and store that in a variable. I'm using const because I can. It's in the ECMAScript 2015 definition as another way to declare a variable in addition to var and let. Generally these days you should not use var. Const and let should get you as far as you need. And so now we're console logging hi and their selected country. We don't actually need to do that anymore. And so now we just have a fetch request. So this will make a request to this URL, which is a relative URL, which is what you need for the Linux lab. And it's pulling the text file from this same directory. So the commands I showed at the beginning of the stream will pull these text files into your Linux lab directory, or if you can use the scp command, which I'll pull up real quick. It's this again, to pull it to your local computer if you have a Linux or Mac terminal available. You might notice that I'm using WSL. It's because the Windows subsystem for Linux is awesome. So we're making a fetch request to this URL, which in this case will grab the country text file from the same folder, and then we are parsing it as text because it transfers across as just plain bytes of binary data. So we want to parse that as text. I think you can pass an encoding here, but I don't remember. I'd have to look that up. For now, this works just fine though. And so then, after it's parsed as text, you will need to do document. You need to stick the data somewhere. These days, you will probably see this using what is called async await, which is a wrapper around promises. So you make this function an async function, And now you can use the await keyword. So this can be const res equals await fetch. And then this is const data equals await res.text. And then we don't need this line anymore because we have our data available. So a lot of people prefer this because it makes it more clear, but also makes it look a little more like synchronous code, which can be very helpful. And so just to show you that that works, you can pull it up and fetch, and it works just the same. And if you wanted to step through how that works a little bit, we can come into the debugger and stick a breakpoint right there. So when we click the button, it'll pause, and we can do stuff. So let's make this a little bigger. See if I can zoom in down here. Excellent. Alright, so this is the Chrome debugger. As you can see, we have our document, and you can see that there's a lot of stuff on the document. We're not too worried about that right now. So we'll step into this function call, and it grabs the selected country, which is Mexico. So we'll step into this one. It's a fetch request, and so it sends it off. And as you'll notice, your debugger is now not paused, because this is asynchronous, so it doesn't leave it paused so that it can actually go and do it. So we'll put another breakpoint down here, and another one there. So let's do Russia this time. So we'll fetch it, step into it. As you can see, we've got Russia. And then we'll come down here, and you'll see now that res is what you get back from fetch. And it's got a bunch of information on it, like status, which we'll use in a minute. It's got OK, which is just a simple true or false. And then it's got a body, which is what we're parsing as text. So we'll step into this next function call. And again, it's asynchronous, so it just goes away. But we have another breakpoint, so it comes back. I point out that it's asynchronous because your call stack goes away. Anyway, so we are back again, and now we have data, which is the string, and we can grab these elements and set the inner text, and now it should have updated. Yeah, so now it updated in the HTML, and that's all that we're doing in part 1. So hopefully that makes some sense. We'll continue to try and do things like that in part 2. So part 2 is a little more complicated. I'm going to refresh the page so that part 2 is at the top. And for now, I'm going to comment out this header because it takes up a lot of space when I'm zoomed in. Alright, so part 2, we've got our form. And before I get into part 2, I'm going to take a quick bathroom break. So I will be right back. Alright, I'm back. And we are here for part 2. That is actually a very good time to stop, because then I can put a timestamp in the video. Alright, so part 2. So we need to keep part 1 working. That should be just fine, because we're doing 2 separate event listeners, and we have different divs. So we can delete that line, because we shouldn't have to worry about that. We've already copied these files, so we can delete that line. Alright, so let's go through this a little more. So we're adding another section which has 2 elements. We have already added those 2 elements. Done. So the input field is used to enter the file name of a JSON file to be retrieved. Done. Alright, so they say the onClick event, submit on the form is just fine as well. Perhaps even a little better. And so we'll make a request to read the specified JSON file. We're not doing that quite yet. We'll need to parse, format it nicely, and incorporate it into our existing web page, and we have to display all of the information. Alright, so we must set the default value of the boxed, which we did. That's what this value attribute does. So there are currently 2 JSON files, JSON1 and JSON. We have those 2 files. That's all we need from that. Alright, so if they enter something that does not match one of those 2 files, we should not display any JSON data, and instead display a message informing the user that the file does not exist. So we're actually going to do this part first, because that's relatively simple form validation. So let's get the input value. So we need to do document get element by ID. It would also be possible to grab it off of the event. So let's grab the ID first, and then I'll show you the event. So the ID is JSON input and value, and again, we'll just add that to the console log. Shrink this again. Add some more line breaks in here. Alright. So now we have this happening, so we'll refresh to get our latest changes. We will grab the JSON. Okay, so that's using getElementById. Another thing that we could do is event.target, which is the form in this case, because it's a submit listener. So if you do just the value on the form, it should not be what you want. Yep, so that's undefined. But the form has a .elements, and then you have to have a name. So we'll put a name on there. And so you can do elements and then the name .value. So one pro of this is you could save off this in a variable. So const elements equals event.target.elements, and now you don't actually have to do DOM, or the document object model access. You can just pull the values off the event, which is also nice. It's also possible to use what's called the form data API. I'm not going to go into it, but the form data API is sweet. It provides an easy way to manage this data. And so I think it is this constructor that you want. So new form data, and you pass it the form, and it will give you what you need. So that's pretty nifty. We're not going to get into it today though, but if you want to study it, go for it. Anyway, so 2 ways to do the same thing. I'm going to go back to the document.getElementById for this, because I think it is a little more direct, because that's what I really care about. I don't care about any other form elements right now. So this is our input value. Alright. So we want to give them a little message. So let's go ahead and get our result spot. Element by ID, and we called it JSON result. Alright, so there's our result spot. And so if input value does not equal JSON, and it's not equal to JSON1, so if it's not one of our two options, then we want to set the inner text equal to valid file name. Please select JSON or JSON. Alright. So, and then we want to return so that we stop executing this function. It doesn't return to anywhere because it's an event handler, but the return gives us an easy way to stop executing. So in this case, we'll go ahead and put a console log here so that we, for now, can say that we did not return. So we did not return. So hello did not return. If we mistype something, hello, we got our invalid file name. I have a typo. Please select JSON or JSON1. Please type. Alright, so there's that, and then here's this. And if you do something totally wild, it gives the same message. So that now makes it, so one benefit of doing it that way is now the network request will not happen if it's invalid. So we're not actually doing a network request yet, but since we're returning, we will put it here. And so that'll mean we don't do network requests for things that might be malicious or who knows what. So that is why we are doing this early return. So that will take care of that requirement, so we can go ahead and delete that now. Alright, so now we need to make the AJAX request to read the specified JSON file. So let's delete this console log and instead do a fetch. And again, we're going to use a template literal here, and it needs to be relative. And we want to do input value dot text. And so now in our network tab, let's make this a little bigger. We'll get our JSON file, and you can see that our response is indeed JSON. One, I guess, somewhat sad thing is since this is a text file, the content type is just text instead of JSON. So what that means is fetch has a built-in, so we're going to go straight for async await. As I explained a little earlier. And so to get our data, we could await res.json if it was actual JSON. But I'm pretty sure this will throw an error on us because it's not actual JSON. And so here we would console log our data. It might not because it's parsable as JSON. Cool. So since it is parsable, it will deal with it. But it's a little bit safer if the content type is actually JSON. You're working with text files though, so well, so there we go. So res.json will parse it. One thing to note with async await is one of the things people like about it is you can use try-catch blocks again. So here you can catch the error, and if there's an error, you could do result spot.inner text. There's an error parsing the file. So, for instance, if I pulled up this JSON file and made it so that it was no longer valid JSON by doing something like putting a T there. Totally not valid. So we try and get that, and it'll now say error parsing the file. A little nicer, and makes it pretty easy to handle. And we'll add the word data here on the end, because we are going to do some data handling. Alright, so these 2 lines give us data, which, as you can see in this console log, let's fix that so that it actually gives us data again. So as you can see in this console log, the data we're getting back is an object with a property students, which is an array. In this case, it has 3 elements. If you do JSON1, it is a object with property students. That is an array that has 7 elements. So we want to handle both of those cases. And so in this case, we are going to generate some HTML. So const, we're going to call it student HTML, and it is going to be a template literal, as you might have guessed. And so we're going to start with an unordered list, so some UL tags. So we're going to go back to our elements view and focus in part 2. So there's our div that our result is going to go into. And so the end goal of all this will be result_spot.innerHTML, because we're writing HTML. You don't usually want to do HTML with unsanitized things, but we trust this data because it's on our local server. Just be aware. And so we'll stick student HTML inside that element. So JSON, so now this div has an UL in it. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and add an empty line here. And so since this is a template literal, we would want to go ahead and kill that extra space so that it's not there. So now we have some space to work with inside this. So inside this unordered list, we want to write an expression. So in our template literal, we can do $curly bracket, and so the stuff inside here is a JavaScript expression. There's a lot of things you could do in here, but I would highly recommend using the map method. So data.students.map. So this is a function that accepts up to 3 arguments. And so the map method calls the function, the callback function, 1 time for each element in the array. So we're going to take this student data, which is an object. We refreshed. So that we're not console logging anymore. So it's an object that has the 5 properties mentioned in these requirements. And we're going to take that data, so our student data, and we want to return some HTML. So we're going to nest a template literal in here. Some people don't like to do that, and in that case I would recommend doing this. So const student data HTML equals, so you could do it this way. Alternatively, yeah, we'll roll with that. So student data HTML, and so that will be what we put our data into. So now we want to do a list item for each student, and in that list item, for now, we'll just do student data. And this will actually not be what you want, but this is what it tends to do when you try and put a JavaScript object into a string. It'll just say object object. And so we can step through this and see why it's doing that if we wanted to. So we'll come down into our event listener, and we'll just go straight for where we're generating student data HTML. Make this bigger again. Alright. Wrong spot. Alright, so we've got our data, and it's got students. And so these students are objects with properties, and there's even a nested object here with more properties. And so if you step into this and look at the return value, it just takes that and straight up puts object. That would be because the default toString for an object, let's see, is just object. So if you don't change that, then it's just object. You can change it. I wouldn't recommend it in most cases. In most cases, what you want to do, if you do want to just see like the object form, you'll wrap this in parentheses. If you select something in VS Code and type an opening paren, it'll wrap it. And then you want to do json.stringify. So let's refresh, and now this will step through here. And so now you'll see that our return value is the stringified version. So that is something you can do if you want, just like a quick, very dirty way. If you want to make it look slightly prettier, you can add these two arguments, null and to format it a little better. Very helpful tip. It's not going to format in this case because it's just putting it into a list item. But if we were console logging this, so if we were console logging this, you would see the difference. So here's our console logs. And add those two arguments back, your parameters, and now you see that we'll format it a little bit nicer, more like what you would expect JSON to look like. Alright, so coming back to this, we have our list item, and so what we're going to do is called object destructuring. So since this is an object, you can destructure it into the various properties that it has. So as we can see in the console here, we've got first, last, address, major, and GPA. Okay? So now we have those to work with. So you can format this however you'd like in yours, but I'm just going to do first, last, dash, major, colon, GPA, and then we're going to do a line break, and we are going to come down here and put in the address. Address, and it has a city, add a comma, address.state, and then address.zip. Alright, and so you could do things like put in spans, class equals address. So you could like wrap all this in a span, wrap individual pieces in spans. You can do whatever you'd like there. Alright, so now when we get this, we step into it, we pull out our data pieces. As you can see, it's populating each variable for us. Excellent. So we've broken down the parameter, which was just the raw student object, down into the pieces, and then we generate some HTML from that. And do that for each student. So that was the first one, here's the second one. And then you can choose to step over which in that case does the same thing, but you could step over the whole map call if you wanted. So then we just stick it inside a UL and stick it into the HTML, and as you can see, we now have our student data. So we're wanting to clean that up a little bit. Like, we don't need these commas here. And so those commas are actually there because map returns an array, but we're treating it like it's just a string here. And so you can join an array, which is what the default toString does. And so if you don't pass anything here, it joins them with a comma. So we're going to join with the empty string, which will take away that comma. And I'm going to take away this breakpoint because I think we've exhausted that. And so now the comma is gone, which is great. Something else that we could do to clean this up a little bit is, so we could do things like, right here you could do a if res.status does not equal 200. That would imply that something went wrong with the request, like the file wasn't found, or the server died for whatever reason. You could do stuff here to handle that error, but we're not going to because we already validated up here that the input is one of the two files that we know exist on the server. So there's that. Some of you might be concerned about the browser support for async await. So caniuse.com is a great spot. Fetch is, as I was showing earlier, very well supported. 95.6% of the, or 95.36% of all the people that this site is aware of are able to use Fetch. It's like if you're looking at usage, it's pretty much everywhere. But the nice thing about this class is the only ones who have to use it are you and me. And I'm currently running, I believe, Chrome 88. Yep, Chrome 88. Looks like I'm updating to even the latest version of Chrome 88. Maybe 89. I don't think 89's out yet, though. Anyway, so there's that async await, which is like asynchronous functions. Yeah, it's just that asynchronous functions up at the top. So async await is slightly less supported, 94%, but that's still plenty in my opinion for most cases. So there is that. I don't think there's anybody in chat, and I don't see any questions. So at this point, you should have a working part 2. So let's review what we have left here. So the the event handler needs to make an AJAX request to read the specified text file. We are doing that. The returned file needs to be parsed. Fetch is doing that for us. If you weren't using Fetch, you'd have to do some sort of like JSON.parse of whatever text string you have, but we're not doing that because Fetch is doing it for us. Formatted nicely and incorporated into your web page. I think the list is great. You could style it if you want, and we are displaying all the information. Alright, so now we have part 2. So like I was saying, part 2 is a little more complicated than part 1 because we do have to process the data a little bit. But hopefully this is useful to you. So let's walk through it again. So here we have our document.getElementById. Hopefully that's pretty familiar by now. That's how you grab an element that exists in HTML so that you can use it in JavaScript. So we're going to add the event listener for the submit event to the form because that's the element we got. We're using an async function, and we are taking in the event, which is given to us as an event handler, and we are preventing the default action on the event. Very useful. We are, again, grabbing an HTML element, in this case the input, and pulling the value off it. And we are console logging that. We don't have to console log that at this point because we know it's working, but console log can be very useful while working on it. And then we're also grabbing the element that we're going to store our result in. We then check that the input value is one of the two options we have, and if it's not, we say it's invalid, and we stop executing with this nice return statement. And then we're using a try-catch because you should almost always, if not always, wrap spots that you're using await in a try-catch, because otherwise it could throw an error and you wouldn't catch it, and it would crash your server or your program or whatever it is. So we are using await, which is only available inside async functions. And so we are setting the res, or response, variable to the result of awaiting the fetch request. So fetch usually returns a promise. Await will unwrap that promise and give us the result, or response in this case. And we are fetching this URL. Again, make sure it's relative for the Linux lab, and we're just having the input take in the file name, not the extension part of it. And so then we are storing in data, a variable called data, the result of awaiting JSON, which is another method that returns a promise. And so that will parse the response body as JSON and give it back to us as an object, as we saw. And so then we're taking that object, grabbing the student's property, and the student's property is an array, so all built-in arrays have a map method, which we'll call a function, which is this guy. This guy, for each element inside the array. Missing a paren. No. Okay. So it calls this function for each element of the array. And so this is doing some object destructuring. Another way you could do this is you can take in the student data here and do const and stick that there. And so this is actually equivalent, but is slightly longer to type. It's also, generally people will just do it in the function parameters, because then the place calling the function, if you were calling the function elsewhere in your code, would know what properties the object uses. Because at least VS Code will usually share that information. But this also works, and that's basically what putting it in the parameters does. And so then we are doing a template literal and making a list item for each student. We're sticking their first and last name, their major, their GPA, and their address pieces. You could do whatever you want in here, but you do have to include all of the data for each student. And what I was originally planning to do was to do this just as like a nested thing in here, which works exactly the same. Go ahead and comment this out and save so that you can see that it works exactly the same. So we'll refresh JSON1 even. So now we are pulling all the data. There you go. So this is another way you could do it. You could just straight up inline this map. But some people don't like doing that. And I don't really blame them because it's a lot. When you start nesting template literals. Okay, so then we take so map returns an array. So this is now an array of these strings, one for each student. And so we want to join those strings together into a single string, but we don't want to put any sort of separators in them because they're all list items. You could put like a new line if you cared what your HTML looked like, but the dev tools will break it up for you, so you don't really need to do that. Yeah, so then we join it, and so now this is a single string that has all of the student data HTML, and we stick that inside an unordered list and call it good by sticking it inside the result. If that has an error at some point, which could happen with these awaits, or if you are trying to access, like if you typo something, it could give you an error. It will instead just say error parsing the file data. And I would highly recommend pulling up the debugger, sticking a debugger somewhere, like right here, or right here, or both even, and running it. And when it gets to that point, pull it up, check and make sure that your HTML is correct, and if you put breakpoints in those two places and another spot you could put a breakpoint is right here, because we're not currently logging out the error or anything. So if there is an error, so say that you were trying to, so say you typoed this and did like something like this. Let's refresh, get that. So now we are in an error. And so the breakpoint here would let us see the error. Sorry, here. Asterisk is not defined, which tells you that you made a typo, usually, or that you didn't define something. So hopefully that's a helpful tip. Yeah. So that catch block is very helpful to have, just in general, but particularly when doing asynchronous programming, because you never know when something could go wrong. And so that is the basic parts of this assignment. Again, if you have questions, don't use the YouTube comments, use the discussion, unless you just have a comment on something that you would like to see more of if I do another of these videos later in the semester. So hopefully that was helpful. I'm not going to make this code like available anywhere, but you could, I guess, pause the video at various points and copy it, or you could just follow along through the video, however you want to do it. I would highly recommend trying to type it out yourself, even changing some names so that you can understand a little better what does what, because you can always come back to the video if you break it and want to see a working version. Also, you'll want to make sure that you test it once you put it up into the Linux lab, because whatever development environment you're using, I don't have, because I'll just be checking it on the Linux lab. So be aware of that. And I think that is all I have for tonight, or for this assignment. Thank you for watching. Hope it was helpful. Bye.